You're a god on earth. Millions bow when you breathe. Your name is carved into stone, meant to last forever. Sounds perfect, right? Now here's the part they don't put in the textbooks. From the moment you're crowned pharaoh, your life is no longer your own. You can't show fear. You can't show weakness. One bad harvest, the people blame you. A flood comes too late, or too strong. That's on you. Your own family might plot your death. Priests watch your every move, and even sleep isn't safe because betrayal can come from the shadows. And when you finally die, your body is sliced open, organs removed, and your tomb booby-trapped, not to protect you, but to protect your legacy. So before we envy the gold, the power, and the pyramids, let's talk about the dark side of being a pharaoh. Before the crown ever touched his head, before gold weighed down his neck and prayers replaced his name, he was just a child who still smelled of milk and dust, who chased beetles in palace courtyards and pressed his ear to the floor to feel the heartbeat of the world beneath him. But the day the gods chose him was the day his humanity began to bleed out quietly, without ceremony, as dawn broke, pale over the palace, and priests arrived like shadows that could speak, their linen robes whispering destiny, while his mother's hands trembled as she dressed him, not knowing whether to cry or kneel, because when the oracle spoke and the signs aligned, the boy was no longer hers, no longer anyone's, not even his own. He became an object of cosmic necessity, a vessel, a bridge between heaven and mud, and from that moment on, his body belonged to ritual. His voice belonged to decree, and his future belonged to the crown, which is to say it belonged to everyone except the small, frightened boy inside it. The one who wanted to ask why the air suddenly felt heavier, and why no one would meet his eyes anymore, as if looking too closely might remind them he was still made of flesh. They bathed him in sacred oils that burned slightly on the skin, shaved his head to mark rebirth, painted his eyes not to beautify but to transform, each gesture stripping away something ordinary, something human, until even his reflection looked unfamiliar. A statue where a child had been, and when the high priest lifted him before the gods and declared him divine, the boy felt a cold terror coil in his stomach. Because gods did not get to cry, gods did not get to say no, and gods were never allowed to be afraid. Yet fear was all he knew. As the crowd roared and bowed, their love already conditional, their worship already dangerous. From that day forward, every step he took was watched for omens, every word measured for prophecy, every illness treated as a cosmic emergency, because his body was no longer a body. It was the nation's spine, and if it bent, everything might break. So they fed him carefully, guarded his sleep fiercely, isolated him completely, until loneliness became as normal as breathing, and play became a memory spoken of in the past tense, like a life that had belonged to someone else. He learned quickly that affection was strategic, that smiles hid calculations, that tutors taught obedience before wisdom, and that love, when offered, came wrapped in expectations so tight it was hard to breathe beneath them. Because a divine child must never disappoint, must never falter, must never remind the world that gods are invented by humans, desperate for order. At night, when the palace fell quiet, he would lie awake listening to the distant river and imagine slipping into it, letting the current carry him far away where no one knew his name or expected miracles from his hands. But even these thoughts felt treasonous, because they told him the gods were watching, always watching, measuring his thoughts as carefully as his actions, so guilt settled into him early, deep and permanent. As he grew, the crown tightened, not physically but spiritually, turning choice into illusion, because what looks like power from the outside feels like obligation from within, an endless list of roles to perform without ever being allowed to step off stage. And whenever he hesitated, whenever doubt flickered in his eyes, they reminded him gently, cruelly, that he had been chosen, that resistance was sacrilege, that to refuse was to invite chaos, famine, flood, death. And so the child learned to swallow his questions, learned that silence was safer than honesty, learned that obedience could feel like virtue when repeated often enough. He watched other children grow into themselves while he grew into a symbol, watched servants age and die while he remained untouched by consequence, preserved like an offering meant for eternity. And sometimes he wondered whether the gods had chosen him, or whether humans had simply needed someone small enough to mold, soft enough to break, because the crown does not descend gently. It consumes. It demands sacrifice. Long before blood is ever spilled, it demands the slow erasure of the self, the quiet burial of desire, the surrender of humanity in exchange for immortality that is mostly loneliness. By the time he was old enough to understand the weight of what had been done to him, it was already too late, because the world no longer saw a boy who could grow up into something else. They saw a God who must remain exactly as imagined, frozen in perfection, trapped in divine expectation, owned by the crown in a way no chain could ever replicate. Because chains can be broken, but belief is unyielding, and belief had already sealed his fate the moment the priests raised him into the light and told the world he was no longer human. Even though, in the quietest part of his heart, he still was and always would be a child who had never been asked whether he wanted to be a god at all. The gold came slowly at first, like a gift that pretended to be kindness. A necklace laid gently on a young ruler's chest. A ring slipped onto a finger, too early hardened by responsibility. A palace expanded room by room until walking its halls felt like crossing a city built solely to contain him, and everyone called it luxury, called it blessing, called it proof that the gods favored him. Yet each new layer of splendor tightened something invisible around his ribs, because gold is not light, not when it is expectation hammered into metal, not when it announces status so loudly that silence becomes impossible. He learned quickly that nothing in his world was neutral, not silk, not stone, not food served on plates carved with prayers, because every object watched him, reflected him, reminded him of who he was supposed to be. And the masks, those gleaming, flawless masks, were the worst of all. Polished to perfection, shaped to an ideal face that never aged, never doubted, never cracked, a face that did not belong to him but that he was required to wear all the same. When courtiers bowed, they bowed to the mask. When ambassadors praised him, they praised the image. When priests spoke of divine order, they spoke to a symbol so distant from the boy inside that it sometimes felt like listening to a stranger's life, being celebrated in his presence. Trust withered early in such a place, because every smile could be bought, every loyalty rented, every kindness weighed against future advantage, and the more wealth surrounded him, the harder it became to believe in anything that could not be measured, counted, or displayed. Even affection felt staged, rehearsed, offered only when witnesses were present, because love without utility had no place in a court built on power, and power, he learned, is most fragile when wrapped in beauty. The palace glittered like a promise, while functioning like a maze, designed to disorient, to isolate, to ensure that every path eventually led back to the throne, back to duty, back to the reminder that nothing he owned was truly his, not the jewels, not the land, not even his own reflection, which stared back at him, altered by cosmetics meant to preserve divinity rather than reveal truth. Servants dressed him each morning, choosing colors that signaled authority, fabrics that restricted movement just enough to enforce posture, and in these moments he understood something most never did. Luxury controls through comfort. It sedates rebellion with softness, convinces the captive that resistance would be foolish because the cage is lined with velvet. He could have anything except anonymity, anything except sincerity, anything except the freedom to be ordinary. And over time, the absence of those things hollowed him out more thoroughly than hunger ever could. Conversations became performances, laughter calculated, silence suspicious, because the wealth that protected him also painted a target on his back, breeding envy in allies and ambition in family, turning kinship into strategy and blood into leverage, until even shared meals felt like negotiations disguised as tradition. The gold masks smiled eternally, while his real face learned restraint. learned how to remain still, even when rage burned behind the eyes, learned how to nod while being lied to, learned how to offer trust as theater rather than truth, because genuine trust required vulnerability. And vulnerability was the one luxury he could never afford. At night, when the palace lamps dimmed and the corridors echoed with emptiness, he would remove the jewelry, piece by piece, setting each item down with care, not out of reverence, but exhaustion, feeling lighter with every removal, as if shedding fragments of a persona that grew heavier by the day. And yet even then, he could not escape it, because the cage was not the gold itself, but what it represented. Permanence, scrutiny, the impossibility of escape without catastrophe. He began to forget who he had been before the luxury arrived, before his name became ceremonial, before his voice carried consequences beyond intention. And this forgetting was the most dangerous loss of all, because identity erodes quietly when constantly mirrored by expectations instead of truth. The world saw abundance and assumed fulfillment, saw riches and assumed power, never understanding that opulence can be a form of starvation, depriving a person not of food, but of authenticity, not of safety, but of choice. And in this way, the gilded cage did its work perfectly, because from the outside it looked like paradise, and from the inside it taught him the cruelest lesson of all, that freedom does not disappear with chains. It disappears with comfort, with praise, with gold so radiant it blinds everyone, including the one trapped within it, to the bars that have always been there. Gold came to him the way night comes to the desert, not all at once, but inevitably, softly at first and then completely, until it was everywhere, clinging to his life, his body, his name, his breath, and what the world called luxury slowly revealed itself as a weight so immense it reshaped him from the inside out. Because gold does not merely decorate, it declares, it announces ownership. It turns a living person into a display meant to reassure an empire that order still exists. And from the moment the first ceremonial mask was placed upon his face, smooth and radiant and impossibly perfect, he understood in a way no one ever explained that this was not adornment, but erasure, that the mask was not meant to reflect him, but to replace him. Behind it, his real face learned stillness, learned how not to betray thought or doubt, because the mask smiled eternally, and the man beneath it was required to match that promise, even when his jaw ached from restraint and his eyes burned with words he could never speak aloud. Every object around him glittered with intention, walls inlaid with precious stones to remind visitors of divine favor, floors polished so brightly they reflected his image back at him as he walked, distorted and multiplied until he no longer knew which version was real. Beds carved from rare wood and draped in silk, so fine it felt like being smothered, gently, luxuriously, as if the palace itself were determined to lull him into forgetting that he was enclosed. Servants moved soundlessly, efficiently, anticipating needs before he voiced them, and at first this felt like comfort, like safety, like proof that the gods truly did protect their chosen. But comfort has a way of dissolving edges, of softening resistance, and slowly he realized that he no longer knew how to want something without it being immediately fulfilled, nor how to trust that fulfillment came from care rather than calculation. Every gift carried implication, every gesture a ledger unseen but meticulously kept, because wealth breeds proximity and proximity breeds ambition, and ambition in a court drenched in gold is sharper than any blade. Family members smiled too quickly, advisors praised too readily, friends, if any could still be called that, measured their loyalty against opportunity, and the more lavish his surroundings became, the more fragile trust grew, because sincerity cannot survive long in a place where everything has a price. He learned to read people the way merchants read scales, searching for imbalance, for hidden weight, for the moment when kindness tipped into strategy, and this constant vigilance hollowed him out, turning relationships into risks and solitude into the only space where he could breathe without performing. The palace was vast, yet it shrank him, Because luxury narrows life, even as it expands possibility, funneling existence into ritual and repetition until days blur into a single continuous performance, and identity becomes something worn rather than lived. His name ceased to feel like his own. It became a title, an invocation, something spoken with reverence or fear, but never intimacy. And when people addressed him, they spoke not to the man, but to the idea of him, the gold-bound image that promised stability and divine order. Even his body felt borrowed, painted, adorned, regulated, fed and groomed according to symbolic need rather than human desire, until hunger, fatigue, and pleasure all became abstract concepts, subordinate to appearance. The gold mask returned again and again, in ceremonies, in public appearances, in moments meant to inspire awe, and each time it settled against his skin like a reminder that perfection is suffocating, that beauty without truth is a kind of violence. Because the mask didn't age, did not falter, did not change, and standing behind it, year after year, he felt himself disappearing, his real features growing unfamiliar, even to his own hands when he touched his face in private, searching for proof that he still existed beneath the layers. At night, when torches dimmed and the palace exhaled into uneasy silence, he would remove the gold piece by piece, crowns, collars, rings, bracelets, placing them carefully on stone tables as if disarming traps. And with each removal his body felt lighter but his mind heavier, because what remained was not freedom but emptiness. A quiet so complete it bordered on terror, for he no longer knew who he was without the weight. The gilded cage functioned perfectly because it never announced itself as a prison. It seduced, it rewarded, it reassured, and from the outside, it looked like paradise. A life of endless abundance, envied by all, while from the inside, it taught him that captivity does not require chains, only expectations that cannot be escaped without destroying everything that depends on you. Gold kept him safe from hunger, from violence, from obscurity, but it could not protect him from isolation, from suspicion, from the slow corrosion of trust that comes when everyone wants something from you and no one dares to want you as you are. He could not confide, because secrets became weapons. He could not relax, because relaxation looked like weakness. He could not even doubt aloud, because doubt in a god-king sounded like blasphemy. And so identity fractured, splitting into public certainty and private confusion, until the distance between them felt unbearable. Luxury promised immortality but delivered stagnation, preserving him like an artifact while the world around him shifted, and he began to understand that the most precious thing taken from him was not freedom of movement, but freedom of becoming. The right to change, to fail, to be inconsistent, to be human. In the end, the gold did what it was designed to do. It dazzled, it distracted, it convinced everyone, including him for a time, that this was power, when in truth it was containment. A cage so beautifully constructed that no one noticed the bars, least of all the man inside, who learned too late that the heaviest prisons are built not from iron, but from admiration, expectation, and gold polished, bright enough to blind the world to the quiet, crushing happening at its center. The palace was quiet in the way only dangerous places are, hushed not by peace but by calculation. Every corridor heavy with memory and possibility, because a throne built on bloodlines is never stable. It pulses like a wound that never quite heals. And from the moment the king's children learned to walk, they were also learning to measure one another, to compare footsteps, to notice who stood closer to the throne and who lingered just outside the light. Love existed in theory, spoken of by tutors and priests, but in practice, it was diluted by inheritance. Because affection in a royal household is always filtered through the question no one asks aloud, who survives? Brothers trained together yet watched each other's backs. Sisters smiled sweetly while committing names and weaknesses to memory, and parents, whether intentionally or not, fed the tension by favoring one child today and another tomorrow, planting seeds of resentment that grew quietly in the dark. The throne loomed over all of it, an unblinking presence, carved from stone and expectation, promising absolute power to one and irrelevance, or death to the rest. And this promise turned childhood into a battlefield disguised as ritual. Meals were shared, yet every cup was suspect, every bite a test of courage, because poison did not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it worked slowly, disguised as illness, whispered away by priests who insisted the gods had simply withdrawn their favor. Tutors disappeared. Servants vanished. A cousin who laughed too loudly one season was mourned the next, and no one asked questions. Because asking meant choosing sides, and choosing sides meant stepping into a war, fought entirely in whispers. The quiet war inside the palace did not rely on open blades, but on patience, on timing, on the slow accumulation of advantage, because blood ties make betrayal easier, not harder, when proximity offers constant access and intimacy provides the perfect cover. Every sibling knew the stories, knew how dynasties ended not with invasion, but with inheritance disputes, knew that history remembered winners as rightful and erased losers as weak. And this knowledge pressed down on them all like a second skin. Alliances formed and dissolved with frightening ease, often shifting overnight based on a rumor, a prophecy, or the subtle tilt of a parent's gaze, and trust became the most dangerous currency of all, because to trust the wrong person was to sign one's own death warrant. The palace rewarded silence and punished honesty, so grievances festered unspoken, turning into resolve, turning into plans made in sleepless hours when the walls seemed to lean closer, listening. Even love between siblings, when it existed, was haunted by inevitability, by the understanding that only one could ascend fully, and that the crown did not tolerate rivals, no matter how closely related. Parents spoke of unity while quietly preparing contingencies, marrying children strategically, sending potential threats away under the guise of honor, because survival at the top requires the willingness to sacrifice blood for stability. And stability, they believed, justified everything. Poison was the weapon of choice, not because it was efficient, but because it preserved appearances. It allowed the palace to grieve publicly, while correcting privately, to maintain the illusion of divine order, while eliminating inconvenient heirs of war one by one. A sudden fever here, a tragic accident there, a long illness framed as fate rather than design, and each loss tightened the atmosphere further, making the survivors more cautious, more isolated, more willing to act first rather than wait. The quiet war taught them to read micro-expressions, to hear what was not said, to recognize danger in generosity and safety in distance, until suspicion became instinct and innocence felt naive. Advisors fueled the fire subtly, whispering concerns about loyalty, reminding princes and princesses of their precarious position, because a divided household is easier to manipulate, and manipulation thrives where fear already lives. Over time, the palace transformed into a living organism, driven by self-preservation, and the throne at its center fed on the anxiety it generated, because fear keeps power sharp. When the king grew ill, the tension reached a breaking point. Smiles stiffened into masks, condolences sounded rehearsed, and every movement was watched with renewed intensity, because the approaching vacancy made patience obsolete. The war could no longer remain entirely quiet. Yet even then, blades stayed sheathed, poisons refined, letters intercepted, loyalties purchased, because open violence would fracture the illusion that kept the kingdom obedient. And illusion mattered more than truth. When succession finally came, it appeared orderly to the outside world, framed as destiny fulfilled, divine will confirmed, while inside the palace, the floors remembered footsteps that would never return. The walls remembered screams no one heard, and the surviving ruler sat on the throne, acutely aware that they had not won so much as endured. Bloodlines had narrowed. Betrayal had paid its price. And the crown settled heavy not only with authority, but with ghosts. Because a throne built this way is never secure. It merely pauses the cycle, teaching the next generation the same lesson whispered through marble and gold. That power inherited through blood must be defended through betrayal, and that the quiet wars we fight among those closest to us leave the deepest scars, the kind no crown can ever truly conceal. The first sign was not hunger, but unease, a subtle wrongness in the air that settled over the palace like dust. Because when the Nile hesitates, the world holds its breath, and everyone knows it long before anyone dares to say it aloud. As messengers arrive with careful words and farmers bow too deeply, their eyes reflecting fear. They are not permitted to accuse the throne with, yet accusation hums beneath every silence. Because the king is not merely a ruler, but a promise, a living contract with the gods. And when the river refuses to obey, it is the promise that appears broken. At first, the water comes late, a delay that might still be forgiven, still explained away with rituals and offerings, with priests chanting louder and sacrifices burning longer. Insisting order will reassert itself if faith remains unshaken, but delay turns to absence. Absence to dread, and the fields crack open like old wounds while granaries echo hollow, and suddenly the king feels the weight of 1,000 eyes even when alone. Because famine does not ask who caused it, it only asks who must answer for it. Hunger transforms devotion into impatience with frightening speed, and prayers spoken in reverence begin to carry an edge, because people can forgive many things, but not an empty stomach, and the divine ruler who once embodied protection now embodies failure, regardless of intent. The king orders relief, opens stores, reduces taxes, commands mercy. But mercy looks thin when there is not enough to go around, and every decision becomes lethal mathematics, choosing which regions starve slower, which cities are spared first, knowing that every choice creates enemies who will remember long after the river returns. Whispers spread through markets and temples, cautious at first, then bold, questioning whether the gods still favor the crown, whether the king's rituals were performed correctly, whether impurity has crept into the palace unseen. And once doubt enters the sacred narrative, it spreads like rot beneath polished stone. Then come the floods, because the Nile does not only withhold, it also overwhelms, swinging from neglect to violence without warning. Tearing through villages already weakened by hunger, drowning crops meant to save the season, carrying bodies and blame alike toward the capital. And this, too, becomes the king's crime. Because balance is his responsibility, moderation his mandate, and excess proves incompetence as surely as absence proves abandonment. The palace becomes a fortress of tension as advisors argue, priests fracture into rival interpretations. Generals warn of unrest, and the king sits at the center of it all, knowing that nature has handed his enemies the sharpest weapon imaginable, one that requires no conspiracy, only belief. Rebellion does not need to declare itself openly. It begins as refusal, as tax grain withheld, as work slowed, as soldiers paid loyalty instead of coin, and every act is justified by the same quiet logic. A failed king forfeits protection. The cruel truth settles in that the Nile is never just water. It is legitimacy made liquid, and, when it turns unpredictable, legitimacy evaporates faster than floodwater under the sun. Executions follow, framed as purification, scapegoats chosen from priests, officials, foreigners, anyone whose removal might convince the gods or the people that action is being taken. But each death only confirms the fear that order is slipping, that the crown is reacting rather than commanding. The king feels it most intensely at night, when the palace is silent and the weight of divinity offers no comfort, only isolation because gods are not allowed to fail. And yet failure surrounds him, visible in the faces of messengers, audible in distant unrest, measurable in diminishing stores. He remembers the stories, every ruler does, the ones carved into stone as warnings disguised as history, of kings dethroned not by armies but by drought, not by assassins but by flood, their names cursed not because they were cruel, but because they were unlucky, and luck is indistinguishable from virtue when survival is at stake. As conditions worsen, loyalty thins to the narrow thread of fear, and fear is unreliable, snapping without warning when desperation outweighs consequence. And the king realizes that his life has become collateral in a natural argument between land and water, an argument that does not care about crowns or prayers. Even if the Nile eventually returns to balance, the damage is already done, because famine teaches people that the gods are negotiable, and floods teach them that the king is mortal. And once those lessons are learned, they cannot be unlearned. By the time the waters finally recede or rise correctly, the throne has already cracked, its sanctity compromised, its occupant marked. Because survival does not restore faith, it merely postpones judgment, and everyone knows that the next disaster, because there is always a next one, will not be endured with patience, but met with blades sharpened by memory. In this way, every natural disaster becomes a trial with only one acceptable outcome: perfection. And perfection is impossible, so the king lives knowing that the Nile does not need to kill him directly. It only needs to misbehave long enough for belief to turn, for hunger to harden hearts, and for the quiet consensus to form that the gods have withdrawn their consent. And once that happens, no army, no ritual, no crown heavy with gold can protect a ruler whose fate has already been carried downstream by a river that refused to obey. They never seized power loudly, never reached for the throne or spoke the word control aloud, because the most effective dominance wears the face of devotion, and the priests understood this better than anyone, arriving first as servants of the divine and ending as architects of the king's reality, without ever appearing to change position at all. In the beginning, they were guides, interpreters of omens, and keepers of ritual, necessary but peripheral, men who bowed deeply and spoke softly, reminding the young pharaoh that his divinity required constant alignment, that gods were precise beings who noticed details mortals overlooked, and so they advised gently at first. Adjust a ceremony here, delay a decree there, always framing guidance as protection, never as instruction. Every suggestion came wrapped in reverence, every correction disguised as concern, and because the pharaoh's authority rested on divine approval, refusing them felt indistinguishable from refusing the gods themselves. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the language shifted. Advice became expectation, interpretation became judgment, and judgment became leverage. Because once the priests convinced the court that only they could hear the gods clearly, the pharaoh himself became dependent on their hearing. They whispered of balance and cosmic order, of unseen forces displeased by minor deviations, of sacrifices insufficiently pure, or words spoken at the wrong hour. And when misfortune followed, as it always does eventually, they were ready with explanations that subtly relocated blame away from nature and toward ritual failure, which could only be corrected through stricter adherence, deeper reliance, greater authority granted to those who knew the gods best. The pharaoh, isolated by divinity and trapped by expectation, listened, because doubt was dangerous and certainty comforting, and the priests offered certainty in a world that increasingly punished mistakes. Over time, they learned which fears resonated most deeply: famine, rebellion, divine withdrawal, the collapse of legacy. And they used these fears not with cruelty but with patience, applying pressure so gradually that resistance never crystallized into opposition. They praised the pharaoh publicly, while correcting him privately, creating a contrast that made their approval feel rare and precious, something to be earned and protected. And soon, Decisions were no longer made without consulting the temples, not because the pharaoh was weak, but because the system rewarded obedience with reassurance and punished independence with anxiety. Ritual calendars expanded until governance itself revolved around sacred timing, making political urgency subordinate to divine scheduling. And priests began to shape policy simply by declaring certain actions unfavorable to the gods at critical moments. Opponents of priestly influence were labeled impure, skeptics framed as dangerous, and rivals accused of angering higher powers, because spiritual language silences dissent more efficiently than force ever could. The pharaoh noticed the change only in fragments. A decree delayed, an execution justified as purification, a war postponed because omens clouded the horizon. Yet each fragment aligned with reason, with caution, with wisdom as defined by those who interpreted the divine. Meanwhile, the temples grew wealthier, their storehouses fuller, their influence wider, until they rivaled the palace itself, not through challenge, but through indispensability, because people trusted priests in ways they feared kings, and the priests cultivated that trust carefully, presenting themselves as mediators between a volatile ruler god and an anxious population. The most effective control came not from telling the pharaoh what to do, but from shaping what he believed was possible, permissible, or dangerous, narrowing his choices until freedom still existed in theory, but not in practice. He could rule, yes, but only within the boundaries of cosmic order as they defined it. He could command, but only after signs were read. He could punish, but only those already deemed impure. And in this way, authority remained his while power slowly migrated elsewhere. Even moments of defiance were anticipated, met with sorrow rather than anger, with warnings of imbalance rather than threats. And when misfortune followed, as coincidence ensures it sometimes will, the priests needed only to look mournful and say nothing at all. By the time the pharaoh realized that his voice echoed strangely, as if passing through layers before reaching the world, it was too late to separate belief from manipulation, faith from fear, guidance from control, because the priests had not replaced him. They had enclosed him, surrounding the throne with doctrine so thick that movement itself became sacrilege. They still bowed, still spoke softly, still claimed to serve the gods alone. Yet it was their whispers that shaped destiny, their interpretations that decided life and death, and their silence that condemned as effectively as any decree. Because in the end, the pharaoh ruled the land, but the priests ruled meaning, and meaning, unseen, unquestioned, sacred, proved far more powerful than any crown forged of gold. The empire never truly slept. It only closed one eye at a time, and beyond every horizon lay someone counting its breaths, measuring its strength, waiting for the moment when vigilance faltered. Because power that stretches far enough to touch many borders also stretches thin. And the pharaoh felt this tension constantly, like a low ache beneath the ribs, the awareness that every sunrise illuminated not just his lands, but his vulnerability. Messages arrived endlessly, clay seals broken in haste, voices hoarse from long travel, speaking of skirmishes in distant deserts, of border towns refusing tribute, of foreign kings testing resolve, with raids small enough to deny but sharp enough to provoke. And each report demanded attention, because neglect, even for a season, invited escalation. War was never singular. It layered itself atop governance until peace felt like an administrative illusion, and the cost of ruling an empire lay not only in armies marched and blood spilled, but in the exhaustion of perpetual readiness, the impossibility of rest when threat could emerge from any direction at any time. Rebellions often began quietly, disguised as local grievances, delayed taxes, disputed officials, yet everyone understood their true language, because rebellion is rarely about injustice alone. It is about opportunity, about sensing weakness at the center and deciding to exploit it before someone else does. The pharaoh responded with force when necessary, diplomacy when possible, but each choice carried consequences far beyond the immediate conflict, because crushing one rebellion too harshly bred resentment elsewhere. While mercy could be read as hesitation, and hesitation in an empire built on projection of strength was contagious. Foreign wars were different, colder, fought not just with weapons but with narratives, alliances, marriages, gifts, and threats layered carefully like armor. Because enemies beyond the horizon did not need to defeat the empire outright, they only needed to drain it slowly, to keep it moving, spending, bleeding until stability eroded from within. Soldiers aged quickly in constant campaigns, veterans returned hardened and restless, generals accumulated influence that rivaled the throne, and the pharaoh understood the irony too well. The men sent to protect the empire were often the same ones capable of challenging it. Because loyalty forged in war is powerful but conditional, tied to success, reward, and belief in leadership. Every victory demanded celebration to reinforce legitimacy. Every loss required explanation to prevent doubt from spreading, and in both cases the cost was enormous, measured in grain diverted to armies, labor pulled from fields, sons taken from families, and time stolen from governance. The empire expanded and contracted like a living thing under stress, borders shifting not only with conquest, but with attention, and the pharaoh learned that distance itself was an enemy, because commands weakened as they traveled, authority diluted by geography, until local leaders began to feel autonomous, interpreting orders in ways that favored their survival over centralized control. Nights in the palace were punctured by the awareness that while torches burned in the capital, fires might also burn in frontier villages. That while rituals reaffirmed divine order at home, foreign gods were being invoked elsewhere to justify resistance, and that empire was a fragile agreement, sustained by force, fear, and belief in equal measure. The cost accumulated invisibly at first, then unmistakably, as treasury reserves thinned, as infrastructure decayed under the strain of constant mobilization, as the people grew weary of sacrifices that never seemed to end, because endless war erodes not just resources but imagination, narrowing the future, viewer to survival alone. The pharaoh bore this cost personally, trapped between the necessity of appearing unshakable and the reality of knowing that no empire is ever as stable as it pretends to be, that every conquered land carries resentment like an ember waiting for wind. Advisors argued endlessly over strategy, priests framed conflicts as divine trials, generals demanded authority, and through it all the pharaoh remained the axis around which the strain rotated, absorbing pressure from every side, because empires demand a human center to blame when borders bleed. Even moments of calm were deceptive, because peace in one region often meant preparation for war in another, and the absence of conflict felt temporary, suspicious, as if silence itself were a tactic. In this way, enemies beyond the horizon ruled the pharaoh as much as he ruled them, dictating his schedule, his priorities, his sleep, his legacy, because power at this scale does not allow disengagement, only constant negotiation with risk. By the time age or illness slowed him, the empire had already marked him with its cost, carving lines into his body and caution into his decisions, and he understood then that ruling an empire that never sleeps means never fully living within it, always standing slightly apart, listening for distant thunder, knowing that the horizon is not a boundary but a promise, that someone, somewhere, is always preparing to test whether the crown still has the strength to answer. He stood at the center of everything and belonged to no one, a figure surrounded by voices, footsteps, petitions, prayers, yet sealed inside a silence so complete it echoed, because loneliness at this height is not the absence of people, but the absence of safety. The knowledge that every presence carries motive and every smile contains a calculation. From dawn until nightfall he was never alone. Servants dressed him, guards followed him, advisors spoke over one another. Family members hovered close enough to touch, yet not a single one of them knew him, or was allowed to, because knowledge is dangerous in a palace where affection can be weaponized and intimacy becomes leverage. Trust eroded early, worn down by small betrayals that taught lasting lessons. A confidant who repeated a private doubt. A sibling who listened too closely. A parent whose love bent subtly toward ambition. And once learned, this lesson could not be unlearned, because power punishes naivete swiftly and publicly. Even family, bound by blood and shared memory, existed behind a veil of caution. Their words weighed for implication, their gestures examined for alignment, because history had already proven that blood makes betrayal easier, not harder, when inheritance and survival share the same space. Meals felt ceremonial rather than communal, laughter sounded rehearsed, and moments that should have been tender were stiff with awareness. Because nothing destroys spontaneity faster than consequence, and every word spoken near the throne carried weight beyond intention. He longed, sometimes painfully, for a single unguarded conversation, a moment where he could speak without measuring impact. But such moments did not exist because vulnerability invited exploitation, and exploitation often wore familiar faces. Advisors praised loyalty while positioning themselves advantageously. Friends remained careful. Lovers were chosen as much for politics as for desire and affection, when genuine became frightening rather than comforting, because it created something to lose. The loneliness deepened, not because he lacked companionship, but because he lacked reciprocity. Everyone needed him, depended on him, feared him, but no one could meet him as an equal. And equality is the soil where trust grows. Even silence was not his own, monitored, interpreted, filled with meaning by others eager to decode his mood. And so solitude, when it came, felt haunted rather than peaceful. Because isolation offered no refuge, only space for doubt to expand. At night, when the palace quieted and the weight of performance lifted slightly, he felt the loneliness most sharply. An ache that no luxury softened. Because loneliness does not respond to comfort. It responds to connection. And connection was the one thing his position forbade. He could not confess fear without weakening authority, could not share grief without inviting speculation, could not express uncertainty without destabilizing belief. And so, emotions were swallowed, compressed into composure, until even he struggled to recognize them clearly. Thousands depended on his stability, his clarity, his restraint, and this dependence became its own form of isolation, because being needed is not the same as being known, and often it is the opposite. Over time, he learned to keep people close while remaining unreachable, mastering the art of presence without access, because distance protected him even as it hollowed him out. The cruel irony was that the more power he held, the fewer places existed where he could set it down. Because power follows its holder everywhere, reshaping every interaction, bending every relationship slightly out of true. He watched others confide, laugh freely, argue honestly, and felt a quiet envy not for their status but for their safety, for the permission they had to be imperfect without consequence. In the end, the loneliness became less a feeling and more a condition, a constant state like gravity shaping posture, thought, and expectation, until he understood that his greatest isolation was not from others but from himself, from the version of him that might have existed if trust had been possible, if family had been shelter rather than strategy, if proximity did not always carry risk. Surrounded by thousands, revered by millions, he remained profoundly alone, because the highest throne in the world is also the furthest place from being truly seen, and the cost of absolute power is learning that even love must keep its distance when survival is always at stake. He lived wrapped in divinity, spoken to as if decay itself had been outlawed by his birth, his body treated as sacred territory. No hand could touch without permission, no illness could name aloud. Because gods are not supposed to rot, not supposed to bleed meaningfully, not supposed to end. And yet death does not negotiate with titles. It only waits, patient and inevitable, until the breath finally falters and the illusion collapses in a single fragile moment. And in that instant, the god is gone, and only a body remains, heavy, cooling, unmistakably human. What followed was called preservation, honor, immortality, but it began with violence so intimate it would have horrified the living man who once occupied that flesh. Because the rituals that promised eternity required dismantling him piece by piece, stripping away the very humanity his divinity had denied. The priests approached not with reverence, but with precision, their hands steady, their faces calm. Because this was not mourning, it was procedure, and the body that had once commanded armies now lay silent and compliant, no longer able to refuse, no longer able to feel, and that was the only mercy in it. They cut him open carefully, deliberately, a blade tracing a path along skin once perfumed and protected, opening the torso as if unlocking a container, and the organs, those fragile, vital things that had once carried fear, hunger, desire, were removed one by one, weighed, cleaned, catalogued, placed into jars like offerings, because even in death the body was expected to perform symbolism rather than simply exist. The brain, seat of thought and memory, was considered unnecessary, extracted through the nose in a method both efficient and grotesque, because intellect had never been the source of his divinity, and so it was discarded without ceremony. An unspoken admission that the mind mattered less than the image. The heart alone was spared, left inside the chest not out of sentiment but utility, because it would be judged, weighed against truth in the afterlife, as if truth could be measured by mass, as if morality could be quantified after a lifetime spent performing righteousness for survival. His body was dried, desiccated, emptied of moisture until skin clung to bone like parchment, until what remained resembled not a man but an artifact, something closer to an object than a person. And all the while the priests spoke of care, of devotion, of eternal life. Even as the physical reality told a different story, one of control extended beyond death, of ownership that did not end with breath. Wrappings followed, layers upon layers of linen soaked in resin, binding limbs into rigidity, erasing movement permanently because the afterlife demanded stillness, demanded that the body become symbol rather than vessel, and the process took weeks, months' time, stretching long after the world he ruled continued without him. Because death does not pause history, it only removes one actor from the stage. The irony was sharp enough, known only to the dead, that a man who lived untouched could not die untouched, that a god who inspired fear and obedience would be handled more invasively than any servant, because ritual sanctifies what would otherwise be recognized as desecration. Masks were placed over the ruined face, gold molded into an idealized version of features now shrunken and unrecognizable, restoring perfection artificially, because even in death the image mattered more than the truth. And the truth, that this god had decomposed like any other body, was carefully concealed beneath layers of craftsmanship and belief. Spells were spoken to return senses, to grant breath, sight, speech in the next world. Yet there was a quiet cruelty in this, because those senses had been removed, destroyed, denied, and no incantation could change the fact that the body had been rendered inert, its humanity traded for preservation. Tombs were sealed with ceremony and threat, curses carved to deter disturbance, as if the dead king might still need protection from the living. Or perhaps as if the living needed protection from the knowledge that gods end the same way everyone else does. He was entombed with objects meant to serve him eternally, food, weapons, statues, even people in earlier times, because the living could not imagine a world where power did not follow him, where hierarchy dissolved, where death flattened all distinctions, and so, They built continuity artificially, burying denial alongside the body. Yet beneath the gold, beneath the spells, beneath the stone, the truth remained unavoidable. That divinity had been a role performed by flesh, and flesh had failed as it always does. Living as a god meant never being allowed to acknowledge fear of death, never being permitted to prepare honestly for the end, and dying as a body meant surrendering completely to hands that had once trembled before him, now steady because power had finally left the room. In the end, immortality was not consciousness or freedom or continuation. It was stasis, preservation without awareness, a body locked in eternal stillness while stories replaced substance. And the greatest unsettling truth of all was this: that after a lifetime spent denying his humanity, it was only in death, cut open, emptied, wrapped, sealed, that he was finally treated exactly like what he had always been, a human being, fragile, finite, and powerless to stop what ritual politely called eternity. The fear did not begin at death, but long before it, creeping in quietly once a ruler understood that memory is more fragile than stone, and immortality far less certain than priests promised. Because to be forgotten is a second death, one far more terrifying than the first. And every pharaoh knew that the moment his name stopped being spoken, his power, earthly and divine, would truly end. Tombs rose from this fear, colossal and elaborate, built not merely as resting places, but as arguments against time itself. Declarations carved into rock that insisted, I was here, I mattered, I must endure. And yet beneath the grandeur pulsed panic, because history was already crowded with rulers whose monuments crumbled, whose names were chiseled away, whose afterlives dissolved into anonymity. Curses were born not from superstition alone, but from desperation. Threats, etched into walls to intimidate both looters and fate, because if violence could not preserve memory, perhaps fear could. And so warnings promised madness, death, divine retribution to anyone who disturbed the tomb, as if terror itself might stand guard when armies and dynasties inevitably failed. The ruler imagined darkness pressing in, imagined centuries passing without witnesses, imagined silence so complete that even the gods might forget the shape of his soul. And this imagination haunted him relentlessly, shaping decisions, draining treasuries, consuming labor, because immortality required constant reinforcement. Panic followed him through life disguised as preparation, commissioning statues in every city, ensuring his likeness multiplied beyond count, ordering scribes to record victories generously and failures sparingly, rewriting history before history could write him, because memory is malleable, but only while power remains. Even rivals were erased strategically, their names scratched out of records, their faces defaced on reliefs, because watching others disappear taught a brutal lesson, that remembrance is not guaranteed by greatness, but by control. Tombs grew more hidden, more complex, more deceptive, buried beneath layers of secrecy and misdirection, because past rulers had learned too late that visibility invited violation, that reverence decays faster than greed, and that eternity attracts thieves as surely as it attracts worship. The irony was cruel. The more elaborate the tomb, the more tempting the target, and many pharaohs understood this even as they continued, because fear does not always lead to wisdom. Sometimes it only leads to excess. Priests spoke soothingly of eternal judgment, of names spoken forever in the afterlife. But rulers noticed how often temples were repurposed, how gods themselves faded, merged, vanished. And if gods could be forgotten, what hope did men truly have? The fear intensified as death approached, because illness strips away illusion faster than any rebellion. And in those final months, the ruler watched attendants rehearse mourning, watched successors maneuver, watched loyalty loosen, and realized with quiet horror that the world was already preparing to continue without him. Tomb inscriptions became more frantic, curses more explicit, prayers longer, lists of titles exhaustive, as if sheer volume might overwhelm oblivion, and the ruler lay awake imagining looters breaking seals, imagining his body exposed, his treasures scattered, his name spoken only as a footnote or a warning. Panic did not fade with burial. It was sealed in alongside him, wrapped into linen, embedded into walls because the tomb itself was a physical manifestation of anxiety, a fortress built against forgetting rather than death. And yet history proved merciless because tombs were breached, curses ignored, names lost, and even the greatest monuments eroded, swallowed by sand or repurposed by those who came later and needed stone more than reverence. Immortality, it turned out, was never promised, only suggested, dangled like comfort before the inevitable. And the truth, every ruler sensed but could never escape, was this: that power fades faster than memory. Memory fades faster than stone, and stone itself eventually surrenders, leaving behind only fragments and guesses. Panic followed every ruler to the grave because no crown could command time, no curse could truly enforce remembrance, and in the end, all that separated the divine king from the forgotten dead was chance. Chance of preservation, chance of discovery, chance of being remembered by strangers who never knew his fear, never heard his prayers, never felt the terror that drove him to build so desperately against the silence waiting just beyond the tomb. After the crown crumbles, what remains is not clarity but silence. And silence is where history does its most aggressive work, sanding down complexity until only shapes that fit comfortably remain, because the truth of any reign is always too inconvenient, too contradictory, too human to survive intact. The monuments still stand for a time, names carved deep into stone insisting on permanence, but even stone grows tired, chipped away by weather, reuse, content, and indifference. And as the physical markers fade, stories rush in to fill the gaps. Stories that simplify, sanitize, exaggerate, and lie with confidence, because myths are easier to carry than truth. The ruler who once governed with compromise and fear becomes either a flawless god or a tyrant carved entirely of cruelty, because nuance does not travel well across generations, and the machinery of memory prefers extremes. Victories are inflated, defeats omitted, rebellions reframed as misunderstandings or erased entirely, because history is written by those who inherit stability, not those who paid for it, and what survives is not what happened, but what was useful to remember. The lives lost quietly. Laborers, servants, soldiers, rivals, family members disappear first because anonymity is the default state of suffering, and the empire that demanded their sacrifice rarely preserves their names, only the symbol that justified their loss. Myths lie politely, often beautifully, telling stories of divine order, golden ages, righteous rule, while burying the panic, the doubt, the sleepless nights, the compromises that kept collapse at bay one more season. Because admitting fragility undermines the fantasy that power was inevitable rather than constantly negotiated. Priests shape memory by preserving doctrine over experience, generals by glorifying conquest over cost, scribes by selecting which records deserve ink and which deserve oblivion, and together they create a version of the past that feels coherent, even when it is profoundly incomplete. The truth lingers instead in shadows, in half-erased inscriptions, in conflicting accounts, in gaps where something uncomfortable once existed, in architectural scars where names were removed, in reused stone where monuments once stood, because erasure leaves marks even when it succeeds. Over time, the ruler becomes a lesson rather than a person, invoked to justify new authority, warned against as an example of failure, or romanticized as a symbol of lost greatness. And none of these roles require accuracy, only resonance. The private man, the one who doubted, who feared, who compromised, who loved selectively, who survived by choosing the least catastrophic option, vanishes almost entirely, because there is no space for him in the story people want to tell about power. Archaeologists and scholars arrive much later, brushing sand from fragments, assembling theories from debris, arguing over intent and meaning. But even then, the truth resists full recovery, because evidence is partial, and interpretation colored by present needs, and certainty remains elusive. What is left in the shadows is the understanding that empires were never as stable as myths claim, that rulers were never as omnipotent as monuments suggest, and that collapse rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment, but as a long erosion disguised as continuity. After the crown crumbles, accountability dissolves unevenly. The ruler absorbs blame or glory in excess, while systems, collaborators, beneficiaries, and victims fade into abstraction. Because it is easier to personify history than to confront collective responsibility. The shadow truth is this: that power survives not because it is righteous, but because people agree, often reluctantly, to sustain it. And when that agreement breaks, history pretends it was destiny all along. In the end, what remains is a version of events that feels authoritative but is riddled with absence. A narrative polished smooth enough to display, stripped of the rough edges where real lives once pressed against it. The crown crumbles, the myths harden, the shadows deepen, and somewhere between what is remembered and what is lost sits the uncomfortable truth that no empire was ever immortal, no ruler ever fully understood, and no story ever told the whole thing. Because the truth, like the people who lived it, was always too complex to survive intact.
If this made you think, consider subscribing for more journeys into the shadows of history. See you next time.